Hi, Dr. Pulsfer here, and the topic today is tangentially related to games and game design, and that is doomsday. What if nuclear weapons existed before World War I or World War II? In other words, alternate history. There's a simple answer to this question, but I want to go beyond that. I want to discuss other notions of the end of the world or end of civilization through warfare in the 20th century. I'm not talking about millennialism or other more or less religious notions of the end of the world. I'm talking about military-related thoughts about the destruction of civilization via warfare. So it's the supposition that the efficacy of non-nuclear weapons would stress or destroy civilization in a great war. The simple answer is history would have been so different that we can't know what might have happened. Certainly World War I and World War II as we knew them would not have existed. Consider something much more contemporary. The current war in Ukraine would likely be over or would never have started but for Russian nukes. NATO would have kicked the Russians out using their superior conventional weapons with the no-fly zone, for example, and sweeping the Black Sea, etc. The Russians probably without nukes would not even have tried it, but there's no way to know. On the other hand, without nukes, there'd have been a war between the Soviets and the West soon after World War II. The only reason there wasn't, I think, is that the West had nukes and the Soviets didn't until the later 50s, and then we had mutual deterrence. So let's start with 1907 and think about this, folks. That's 4 years after the Wright brothers' first flight. And the novel The War in the Air by H.G. Wells, who's better known for War of the Worlds. Wells described a world war dominated by airships and early airplanes. That war ultimately ruined civilization. It didn't destroy the world, but it ruined civilization. Wells in the novel supposes that there's little defense against aerial attack and that it would be very effective. The actuality is that aerial attack, especially this early, or in World War I, for example, was not very effective at all, quite the opposite. What about after World War I? Well, Brigadier General Billy Mitchell, who died in 1936, and whom the B-25 Mitchell bomber is named after, was so adamantly in favor of air power at sea that he ultimately offended his superiors to the detriment of his career. And that may have been maybe why he was a brigadier general when he retired. Bombing of a captured German battleship, which was undefended, unmanned, and not maneuvering, showed that airplanes, even of 1925 vintage, could sink such vessels. But Mitchell was ahead of his time, and I have to admit, this particular example is not quite the end of civilization, but it was the end of warfare at sea as we know it. And of course, in the end, later, he proved to be more right. Now, before we talk about this next gent, keep in mind poison gas had been used in World War I. General Julio Duhay, probably mangled that pronunciation, who died in 1930, was an Italian general and air power theorist. He wrote a book, The Command of the Air, and he, quote, argued the war would become so terrible that the common people would rise against their government, overthrow it with revolution, then sue for peace. That's how Wikipedia describes it. Assuming that poison gas would be used, perhaps he was much more right than he's given credit for today. In the event, poison gas was not used in World War II. In World War I, it hadn't made much of a difference, though both sides used it, and that may be why, in the end, it wasn't used in World War II. It's one of those semi-mysteries that probably some people writing doctoral dissertations have looked into, and I just don't know the result of what they found. But in the event, poison gas was not used in World War II, and consequently, bombing was much less effective. Between the wars, there was sort of a catchphrase or maxim, the bomber will always get through. And of course, there was some evidence early in the war that bombing could cripple a country psychologically. I'm thinking of the Netherlands. But in the longer run, civilization learned to cope with bombing. And most recently, the Serbs in 1999, despite being sort of bombed back into the Stone Age, still kept going. They just finally gave up because they were frustrated and they couldn't shoot down their attackers. It was very, very, very one-sided. The Ukrainians today put up with getting bombed, although in this case it's missiles rather than aircraft, and they just keep on going. And that generally is the response of civilization to bombing. Of course, both in Serbia and Ukraine, no poison gas, no other weapons of mass destruction. You might also think about delivery systems. Even if nuclear weapons had existed in World War I or World War II, there was practically no delivery system in World War I and not a good one until later in World War II. Early nukes weighed 5 tons or even 10 tons. Zeppelins had the carrying power, but they would likely be caught in the explosion because they were so slow. Bombers had little carrying capacity in World War I, and they had short range, unlike the B-29 of late World War II. Somehow this makes me think of the nuclear versions of the game Risk, kind of detached from reality. Yeah, we've got nukes, but we don't have a good way to deliver them. It can be interesting to think of tech developments out of their time, but each one tends to fit well with the rest of its contemporary technology. So I'm not sure how much sense it makes to think of them outside of their time. Who knows? Thanks for listening.